This is Zalman Gagerman's YouTube video to explain the code for messenger. Okay, so we're starting off at the top. The top four lines are just import, import getOp. That's for parsing the command line. Import sys is for certain system commands. Import socket is to get the Python socket library. Import threading is to able to thread out to receive messages. Okay, so starting off with the first function I have is called def server. So we'll see in really the main part of the code, but the idea of server is um, to spin off every time messenger.python is launched based on the command arguments, I'm going to launch into either server or client. Obviously, depending on whether the user requested a server or client, and I'm able to do this with one file by putting these two functions in. So the server and client are going to look very similar, but for server we'll just go down. So serve sock is to create a new socket to communicate with the client. So serve sock that set sock opt. I don't really know what this is, but I saw it in the code example, so I went with it. Then the serve sock bind is to let the operating system know to create a socket on the port that is given by the main function, and then the server is told to listen. I don't really know what 5 means. Again, it was just in the example, so I just went with it. So sock address is the server is going to wait here until the client ends up connecting to a socket on the same port through localhost. So that's what this is, and then send and receive. I'll get into this later, but this goes into after this point, after the server and the client have connected to each other, the code is identical. So I spun that off into one function that I'll look at later. So client is the same first line, creating a socket, and then here the second line of client, we're connecting to the we're trying to request a connection to the server that we set up in the previous function in a different file. And then send and receive, again, as I said, this is where now it just goes to send and receive. So legal arguments, this is pretty self-explanatory. This is just the computer complaining if someone didn't launch the program properly. So get stdin. This is just an easier shorthand way for me to get input from the user for what message they want to send. So now we're into create socket. Again, I wasn't clear about what was up here, but again, this was just shorthand for using the same call on socket.socket twice. So I don't know what it means, but I saw it in the example, so I just went with it. So here we're at send and receive thread. By send and receive thread with the socket, this is now setting up a listener. We'll get to the listener object later, but this is creating a listener object that we then thread off with the socket that we had created up in both server and client. You see, this is the call to send and receive thread. We spin it off as a thread. I print that listener started, and while true, we do send message. We send message from stdin with sock, and then the receive amount with the socket and the receive amount. We'll get to this in a second. So system exit is again just shorthand for system.exit. Easier and quicker for me to type out. Okay, so then we have send and receive. So now this is a loop. I do not use this in my most recent version of code, so I'm going to skip that. Also, in receive and send, I also don't believe that I use that in my code. So now we're at send message from stdin, which again in send and receive thread that does use it. So it's going to be basically an infinite loop until the system quits for sending and receiving. For sending in, and like I said, for sending a message from standard input. So we get a message from standard input. I showed you that function earlier. So if the message is not a zero length message, we send it across the socket by encoding the message, which is what it returns. If it's a zero length message, we say quit the client, we close the socket, and then we quit out of the system. Receive message is a function that is basically a function the listener uses. However, it's not actually called directly in listener, so we're going to skip that. So this is the listener object. So what we're doing, it's subclassing threads. So we're going to initialize it here, and then again we call the super constructor in thread, and then we set the class variable socket to the socket that we passed in the constructor. So now we're in the run. So this is after the user has already called the start method. The start method goes into the super method called start, and it ends up running our run method on a different thread. So again, as an infinite loop, it's just a listener. All it does is listen to see if there's anything coming in from the other side, any messages coming in from the other side. So return message is received and then decoded. It's just a string. So if it's a zero length, if it's not a zero length message, then we print it out and we go back to the beginning of the loop and then wait for a new message. If it is a zero length message, then we realize that either the other guy, either the client and the server, who's ever on the other side, no longer has any interest in the connection. These are just some variables. And then here's the main point of the function. So here we parse out the command line call, and then arglist. It's again for parsing out the how the user wants to run the thread, as in
do
they want a server, what port do they want it to be run on. I didn't end up adding in functionality to connect to any IP other than localhost. So now if length, if it's a good call, if arglist is greater than 0, it means that it means that they requested the server flag. So we're treating it as such. So we're ensuring that everything went properly, and then these are just printing to show the user to double check with the user that the port that they requested is the right one, and then we launch the server, which is the first function that I ever showed you. So if the first um, if the first um, if the variable in arglist, if the variable that was if the flag that was parsed was anything other than -L, then we're quitting out of the system. So else here is just referring to if the flag wasn't called. So if there were less than 2 arguments, it means that there was no if the args list was less than 2 arguments, that means that there was no port entered. It means that it was just the messenger app program that was called, and we're not even going to be considering the program. So now we are calling in the client. We're telling the program that we want this to be a client and not to listen for a server, rather connect to the port that they requested in the system args list, and then server IP, which is just localhost. So it's telling it to connect to localhost. So now it's moving over to the display. So we are showing this is the server that I'm entering right now. We're allowing incoming connections, and then we're connecting to the server here, and we're saying hello, and then we're saying how are you? Fine. I'm doing fine. I hope you're well. Thank you. I am doing very well. CSC 376. CSC 376 is a great class. Now, admittedly, one thing that I struggled with was properly telling the other guy to quit out. I never really got the system to quit, and I could never really figure out why. So that's my messenger app. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.